Well, welcome everyone. I think our live stream is just getting started. Let's make sure. Yep, it is just starting. I know we've got another minute until we are supposed to begin, but it's always nice to be with folks. I am going to click the button so I don't see myself anymore. Where are we? Hide self-view. I highly recommend it for anyone who is sick of staring at yourself in Zoom. And I actually feel like it's appropriate for our session today. First to note that we're missing Rabbi Carney Rose, who I don't think is missing us because I think he's on a beach in Mexico, if I am remembering this correctly. So we miss him, but he's hopefully enjoying himself. So I wanted to return us a little bit as we're beginning to the origins of why we have been doing these sessions. And the original idea back right at the beginning of, really the beginning of the pandemic, was the four of us had this sense that the conversation that we were having when we were together just amongst Jewish professionals was not just different than the conversation that's being had in the public square, but was also in fact different than I think what many folks thought the discourse was like amongst Jewish professionals. What we say, how we say it, the topics and the boundaries, I think are often different than how they are imagined or how they are projected. Similarly, I feel like often we as Jewish leaders have a very different sense or imagination of who American Jews are than who American Jews actually are. So I'm really excited to look at this content with the two of you today and with everyone else who's here. Hope you'll throw in questions and comments and all of these things, because we're going to be looking at the Pew 2020 survey of American Jews. This is a broad look. People may have remembered a few years ago there was another Pew that was done that for some reason seemed to get a lot more press than this one. Haven't read as much about this Pew, but it gives a snapshot of who American Jews are, what we believe, what we think, how we associate and affiliate or how we don't associate and affiliate. And really gives us a picture of that. There are, of course, all sorts of issues and all sorts of critiques of the methodologies of the Pew Report. I'd highly recommend anyone interested in that get in touch with Dr. Kate Rosenblatt, a St. Louisan and a professor over at Emory, who's done a lot of work on this. But broadly, I think we get a snapshot of American Jewry with a lot of interesting content for us to dig into. So we're going to look at that in just a moment. But before we do that, Jim and Rory, you are both back from Israel. So first of all, if folks see that you're a little bleary-eyed, that's why. But I also thought I would just open it up for a moment because I know both of you had pretty profound experiences while you were there. In fact, just before we went live, we were talking about some of those. So I thought maybe we'd start just by opening it up and seeing if both of you wanted to share a reflection from your trip.
Go ahead, Rory.
Thank you, Daniel. And I still haven't fully processed. I should also say, quite the adventure getting back. This was the first time I'd ever been to Israel. It took me 5 flights to get home. So that's a whole other story. So yeah, my jet lag is still a bit lingering. But, you know, so as both of you know, I was there to continue my program with Hartman. Not all of us are senior Hartman fellows yet, but we're still working on it. So it was amazing to be back in Jerusalem and studying. And so a couple of things, I guess, to share. One is that the Hartman content this time around, they really changed on a dime. And it was called Zionism at a Crossroads. And really what so many of the people who were talking to us were grappling with was in large part the response from the most recent conflict with Gaza, recognizing the deep pain of the Israeli Jewish community, of what they had experienced, the fear, which I cannot even imagine, you know, the sirens and the bombings and the rocket attacks and all of those. But seeing a vastly different response coming from the American Jewish community than what had ever happened before. And I think it was Daniel Hartman kept talking about this is the first war that really was a war about occupation. And not that it's the first war since occupation, but where it was really the first war where the international Jewish community was talking about occupation. And so they were really grappling with, and in many ways, I think many of the conversations that we've been having of all of the things that had been kind of under the surface, but had not really been brought to light. So that was a lot of the studying. And then in the course of being there, we did 2 trips. One was that we went to Sheikh Jarrah, the community in East Jerusalem that's been in the news because of the number of Palestinian homes that are slated for eviction, and that has caused so many of the protests that were part of the tensions that we all saw a month ago, I guess. And then we also went to Lod, which is one of the mixed cities where they had all of the riots and the conflict that emerged there. And I don't know that I quite have the language for it, but what became really apparent to all of us was, in many ways, like we're having 2 different conversations. We heard from Palestinian residents, we heard from Jewish residents. And what was amazing is that it wasn't that they were disagreeing with each other, it's that they were talking about 2 completely different things. And in many ways, we kept hearing from a Jewish community that was having a legal argument. It was about who is entitled to the space, what did the law say, what was happening in the Supreme Court, or things like that. And what we heard from Palestinians, and I think what we're hearing a lot from American Jews, is a moral argument. Who do we want to be? What's right? So in Sheikh Jarrah, we kind of went through, and it was all of these like, here's who, the land had been, it had been part of Jordan when Jordan conquered the land, but Jordan never claimed territory. And then when Israel conquered the land, and there's all these rules about war, and when you conquer land in a defensive war, and who's entitled to move populations back into space, and all of those things. And we had all those conversations, but at the end of the day, here's a family that's living in this home that doesn't want to leave their home, right? And that's, I think, what we realized was this kind of huge disconnect. And I think is really also part of the disconnect that we were seeing between the American Jewish community and the Israeli community. So as you know, with Hartman, there's no answers to all of it, but just a lot more questions. And so those are some of the things I'm sitting with right now.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, my experience in Israel just a couple of weeks ago, and unfortunately I can't blame blurry-eyedness on jet lag any longer. I've been home long enough that it's just regular old blurry-eyedness that I'm dealing with. But my experience was in many ways very different than yours, Rory. And on the other hand, the impact on me was, I think, from what you just said, very similar. My wife and I had the opportunity to travel to Israel in a surprisingly different way than we've ever done before. We for many years, we've chaperoned teen trips under the auspices of NIFTY, the North American Federation of Temple Youth Summer Israel Trips. And thankfully, like many Jewish youth organizations, they've been able to bring hundreds of kids to Israel this summer safely. Even though tourism is not officially opened, you can only travel to Israel as part of very defined groups. We were privileged to be able to do so. And that experience in and of itself was interesting. To the restrictions, which Rory, I'm sure you experienced as well, having to be tested multiple times in order to get on a plane, to get out of the airport in Tel Aviv. We also had to have additional testing to be able to leave our group and go off on our own, and then to be tested yet again in order to get back on the plane and return. That in and of itself was a story for another time. But our time there was a little briefer than yours and a little more focused on connecting with people that we have relationships with, friends and family. And also, I chose to use my time to invest in something that I've never done quite as intentionally as I did this time. Over the many years, I've been to Israel many, many times, like all of us. Most of my experiences have been through the lens of the narrative of the Jewish people and our relationship with the land. And I chose this time to use some of my free time to arrange to really immerse myself in a little bit of the Palestinian narrative and to seek to understand and most of all, just to listen to the voice of people who understand a narrative other than the one that in which I've been immersed for my entire life. I traveled to Hebron and to the South Hebron Hills through an incredibly blessed opportunity I had to have a private, somewhat VIP tour of these areas through the lens of Breaking the Silence, Shovrei Shtika. It was 2-on-1. Two of their staff took me privately to visit places I had been before. Daniel, you and I were in Hebron together as part of our time in Hartman, but we replayed that journey, but in a different way, because it was really powerfully silent and quiet for us to just sit there and hear the story. And then the South Hebron Hills, I went to Susia, where I have never been. And met with Palestinian families living the best they can in the face of constant demolition of their homes and the thievery of their crops and their fields by religious settlers who have a different perspective on who owns these lands. And I witnessed the hospitality of these families who invited me into their home for a meal and sat for several hours and just talked about what it is to be living their reality, their perspective. And I began to process in a new way that I've never done before, the fact that these two narratives can both be true in very different ways. After having been trained to say that narrative is not true, it's false, I believe that's the falsehood. The falsehood is to claim that one narrative or the other is false. The next day, my dear friend, Rabbi Arik Asherman, brought me to the Judean Hills and invited me to join with a group of other activists and volunteers who early in the morning, accompanied Palestinian shepherds on their land, guiding their sheep. I've never been a shepherd. It's one of the things, I guess now I can check off my bucket list. Actually, I didn't get to be a shepherd. I just walked with the shepherds. But I spent the morning in this beautiful place that was utter desert with Palestinian shepherds and their children guiding their herd across the fields. And the reason we were there was devastating to me, that if they are not accompanied by Westerners and volunteers who kind of are there to some degree provide a layer of protection for them, but also to document if they end up being confronted. These shepherds are regularly attacked by religious settlers who are seeking to settle the land by pushing the Palestinian shepherds off of their land and replacing them with their own flocks and saying, "We're here, not you." And it was a powerful few hours in the desert. And then, like you, Rory, I got to go later that day to sit with some of the people living in Sheikh Jarrah and to hear their story and to again hear their narrative of their understanding of what's happening to them and their families and their homes. And while I was sitting there, one of the settler families came down the street into their home, which I suspect you were on the same street, probably meeting with the same people. I think Mahmoud Sabih was one of the people that was meeting with you as well. Just hearing them say, it's not that we hate these people, but they're stealing our homes. They're using Israeli law to justify pushing us off of land that we've been living on for 70 years. And that's not fair. Regardless of whether the Israeli legal system is defending their rights or not, we're talking about human beings. And it's not unlike eminent domain conflicts in this country, except that it's the Jewish state. And as one of you said, these are Jewish values that are in place. I also went later that day to Silwan, the other neighborhood of East Jerusalem that's so much in the news. And I happened by coincidence to be there almost moments after the Israeli government came in and demolished a Palestinian butcher shop on land that they claimed they had not gotten proper permits for. And that's a whole other complicated story that I don't want to take time now. But just to say, for me personally, who spent most of the last 4 decades immersing myself in the Jewish narrative and understanding why we have the right to self-determination in this land, I increasingly feel compassion for and understanding of the fact that there is another people, these Palestinian people, who also seek to have self-determination. And unfortunately, we're arguing over the same land. And it's why I am deeply personally committed to the two-state solution, as seemingly unattainable as it feels right now. But I believe it is ultimately the only moral way for the Jewish people to continue to be in this land, and also to do what our Jewish values tell us we must do towards other people. So I know that's not our topic for today, but in some weird way, Daniel, it is, because so much of the Pew study revolves around our attitudes. So thank you for allowing me to ramble for a minute.
No, thank you both for sharing those reflections. Even though, as you said, right, it's a little distant from what we're talking about, I think it's essential and it's important. And just one other note, Jim, I think this is true for you all also. I think we both have adult-centered Israel trips that are on the books for folks who are interested in some of these experiences, that we're making sure that those are built in. So CRC certainly does.
And we do as well next March. I think you're going in February, we're going in March.
Yeah, exactly. January, February for us, March for you. And our non-members,
absolutely open to anybody who's interested. And our trips, I think both will include at least some days of insight into some of what we just described, depending on what is the most appropriate timely experiences we can share. But giving people an insight, and I know, Daniel, you feel the same way, that it's important for Jews to not only experience Israel through the lens of our faith and our history, but also to understand, quite frankly, to understand a little bit of what it means to be an occupying power in our land.
I promised myself when I left Hebron that I would never take a group to Israel without taking them there, or the equivalent, ever again. Yeah.
So I just want to just throw in, because into the chat somebody said that Carney also has trips, so I don't want to shortchange him just because he's on a beach in Mexico. And we're actually exploring doing some interfaith trips to also kind of bring in some of those narratives. And I think just to your point, Jim, like, to me, so much of everything that we're talking about in all of this is, how do we recognize that there can be multiple stories, and the same ways that we can hold all of the different opinions here in this space, this idea that there are stories. And that was, I remember when we left Sheikh Jarrah, so we spoke with some of the Palestinians, and we spoke with some of the Israelis, and we spoke to some more Palestinians, and then we taught Tal Becker, who both of you know incredibly well. It was very involved with the government. He's, I think, an advisor to Yair Lapid, and so he was kind of breaking down the like Supreme Court side of it and all of it. And I remember there were some people, as we left, they were like, well, which is the story, you know, because we'd actually heard 4 completely different stories. It wasn't even like Tal's had like a little, it was like Tal had a whole other story. And for me, the answer was they all are. Like, everyone, because I don't think anyone came in lying. I think like everyone told us their story, but the same way that, you know, and yeah, sometimes stories conflict, or sometimes stories are just independent stories. And so, you know, also in the way that we have a Jewish story of the land, we have multiple religious stories of the land, but I mean, every person has a story.
And Rory, you know, it's funny, just to add, our human need to say, well, our story is the right one. That is a very non-Jewish thing, I think. You know, our Jewish tradition teaches us that actually multiple narratives can coexist, and that's, I mean, the whole tradition of the Talmud and Jewish law and debate, and ironically, the Knesset as well. I mean, you step into the Knesset and you see that lots of different narratives can coexist, but for some reason, the American Jewish community has clamored for this sense of, well, no, there's only one party line. We're not allowed. We fabricate all these reasons to convince ourselves that we don't have the right to say other truths other than the standard one, and that's not Jewish. You know,
So I want to bring in some more texts here from Pew, because I think it's going to give us much of what you're saying there, Jim. So first, let's start here, which is just an overview. Is everyone seeing this? You seeing this chart? Great. Which is just an overview of who American Jews say they are. When they are surveyed, who do we say that we are? So we have this pie chart at the top, Reform being the largest identified group, followed closely by no particular branch, right? 17% conservative, 9% Orthodox, which held steady from the last survey, but we're going to talk about some important demographic changes that are happening there. Below that, and 4% for some other branch. So first, anything shock either of you about that?
It's not shocking because I've heard discussion of it, but I think it's notable that although the pie chart at the top is kind of what we're used to seeing, if we look at the age breakdown, it's not shocking, but it's interesting to me, especially the shift towards many, many young people under 30 and really under 50, if you take them together, identifying themselves as Orthodox. That's a big shift in the pie chart at the top over time. And I think we need to acknowledge that and recognize it.
Well, and the growing of no particular branch. I mean, you sort of have like the extremes are sort of pushing out Reform and Conservative here.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know, one of my takeaways from this, and I've been saying this for a while, is that the future of American Judaism is more Orthodox. And I think that comes as a surprise to folks, particularly because, right, in the 1950s, Jewish sociologists said that there would be no such thing as Orthodox Jews in a generation and a half or whatever it is. And now it strikes me that, I think that my children and grandchildren's generations are much more likely to be significantly more Orthodox institutionally. Rory, do you have, as someone in the Orthodox community, I'd love to hear some thoughts here.
I mean, look, like, I'm trying not to gloat here and at the two of you. So, I think it is really interesting. First of all, I think we've realized that everything that the sociologists were saying in the 50s about Judaism has proven to be pretty inaccurate. I want to like dig in much deeper. From what I've seen, I think there's a combination of factors. One includes that you have a significantly higher birth rate in the Orthodox community than in other communities. And so some of this is not like people necessarily shifting so much as we just produce a lot more Jews than any of the other denominations are doing. And so that's one element to it. But I also do think that, that's why I'm kind of noting, right, the people who say like no particular branch or the people who say Orthodox, I think we're also seeing a shift of like people really wanting to find, I think like people really finding their own path. I think it's not just about what they've inherited, but I think people recognizing that they either don't have to identify or wanting to identify in really immersive ways. And I'm trying to be careful because I don't mean this as a criticism of Reform and Conservative Judaism. I genuinely don't mean it as a criticism, but I think that we've also seen ways in which, and I think in large part responding to those sociologists of the 50s, our Jewish community kind of tried to shift to like, parties, right? It was all about like, how do we just become cool? And at the end of the day, I think people want meaning. And that's not to say, so I think people do find it in the various denominations, but I think that some of our efforts in these denominations have been lost because we've sort of lost our focus of what the point is.
Yeah, I want to just offer another alternative, additional, I don't want to say alternative, but an additional perspective. And I don't know if there's a technical, sociological or psychological term for what I'm going to describe, but I think of it as the swinging of a pendulum from generation to generation. I think if we reflect backwards, we might discover that one or two generations in any given community, there tend to be shifts from more tradition and more ritual and more, definition of boundaries to less. The younger generations tend to resist that which their older generations find appealing, and then eventually the pendulum swings back. So I think we need, while I agree with everything you said, Rory, I also wonder whether that increase of people away from conservative and reform into more observance on the one hand, plus that, as you noted, that growth of no particular branch, there are very large numbers of unaffiliated, borderline affiliated, or borderline connected people in the Jewish community that may reflect two pendulums swinging simultaneously, and we'll only know when we can look back with the the memory as opposed to predictive.
I really find the language of thickness of Jewish identity, thinness and thickness, also to be helpful here. We often think of Jewish identity as being a binary, right? Like you're Jewish or you're not Jewish. But I think particularly when talking about how we continuously are resorting ourselves into movements or non-movements, and what that means for thickness of Jewish identity has a lot to say here too. The other thing, Jim, speaking of the no particular branch, it struck me, right? Like that probably includes some of the folks who are in Moishe House and in Next Door and Ashrenu, who are doing really interesting, highly engaged, emergent kind of Jewish stuff. And it includes folks who like barely will check, yes, they're Jewish on a survey.
Yeah, and to use Israel, it's Chiloni, but both forms of Chiloni. Chiloni who actually are very religiously connected, but just don't identify with any movement in particular. But every Shabbat, they are reciting Kiddush, or every Pesach there. And then there's Chiloni who are Lagamre Chiloni, completely secular, who, would just as soon have a picnic on Yom Kippur than to even acknowledge that it's Yom Kippur. And I think we have the same phenomenon in a different form in our American Jewish community. And I'm mostly worried. I love your metaphor of thickness and thinness, because I know some really, and I hope nobody takes this personal, I know some really thick liberal, reformer, conservative Jews whose connection to Judaism is very thick and robust and serious, but who would be defined by other Jews as very non-observant traditionally, but who are immersed in their form of Jewish life. And we also all know some incredibly thin Jews of all denominations who call themselves Jewish, but there's no real reason that there's no thickness to it. It's completely shallow or thin. And I don't mean that pejoratively. It just is a description.
Well, I think what you're raising also, though, I think we need to note before we go further into all of this is that these surveys are always subject to the questions that are asked. I can't remember what it was, but there was a survey years ago that I loved, kind of going to what you said, Daniel, where instead of asking what denomination you were, it sort of it shouldn't say ranked, it listed every denomination. And for each one, you sort of said like, what is it, like not at all, a little, somewhat, a lot, very much, and so this idea also that you can be like, a little bit Orthodox and like very much conservative and like a lot reform and a little bit Reconstructionist, right? Like that actually we can kind of see ourselves in this multitude of spaces. And I mean, I'm kind of sort of caught up in what you said about the 50s sociologists, but I think we're just aware also of some of the abuse that has come from some of those individuals and the ways in which I think also that scholarship, is impacted by the questions that are asked. So I don't mean to say that I think that this data is not worthwhile, because I'm really interested in talking about it more. But even asking that question and saying that you have to pick one denomination, or the other choice being like non-denomination, as opposed to even that subset of like non-affiliated but deeply active, as opposed to prefer not to identify as Jewish, right? Like those choices are going to already be a value statement of the people doing the survey onto our Jewish community.
Yeah, and membership or affiliation with a denomination, much less an institution, is increasingly less important to many people. Many people say, look, I'm going to go to a conservative shul when they offer something that meets my needs. I'm going to go daven in an Orthodox synagogue when they appeal to me. I'm going to come to participate in a Reform congregation. I'm just going to be Jewish, and that this particular Pew data doesn't talk about all Jewish, no particular branch sounds pejorative, but it might be, well, no, I'm all branches. I'm a really engaged Jew.
I want to pull in a comment from Carol Rose here, who noted that maybe part of what we're seeing, and I tend to think actually that it's, to some degree, all of what we're seeing is sociological, in the sense that for a long time, particularly at that peak in the 50s and 60s, right, American Judaism and Jewish community was built to look like Christianity. And so the synagogue became the center and the movement became the most important part. Just like, you went to your church on Sunday and it was a Methodist church or whatever it was. In that as we have moved away from that Christian notion of what Jewish identity is and needs to be, what might Nana would have called the Goyshe Cup version of Judaism, that simply the model of how we answer has changed, and thus the denominations are less important to individuals. I want to bring in another chart here. Okay. This is a chart. Jim, I don't know if you remember our conversation about this question. It must have been, well, I remember it was 2016. It was August or July of 2016, right before the election. I was getting ready to start a job as a rabbi at a large conservative shul in Cincinnati. And Adam Cutler, Jim, and myself, Adam was another rabbi in our program, sat down and had a whole conversation about would it be more important to us that our grandchildren share our liberal values or that they be Jewish, right? Which is to say, would I prefer that my grandchildren share my core values of the world, or would I prefer that, you know, in that world, they're sort of right-wing Haredim? And it broke me because my answer was very much, I want them to share my liberal values, particularly after our visit to Hebron. It really sort of solidified all of that. And that's what this says right here, that actually across the board, across the age demographics here, American Jews find it more important that our grandchildren share our political convictions than that they think of themselves as Jewish in the two generations. So I'm interested what you all see looking at this chart.
Well, Daniel, yes, I remember that conversation vividly, and how passionate we all were about our opinions. To me, these first two categories do not, and I say this with some caution and as much humility as I can muster. I don't mean to offend somebody who feels otherwise, but I'm not sure for most of the people who answer this, there is a distinction between one's political convictions and one's Jewish identity and values. In other words, those of us who tend to believe that liberal, progressive Jewish political values are important would also argue that those are Jewish values. And ironically, and this is the source of great conflict in our Jewish community, those who are more conservatively aligned politically would argue that their Jewish values support those. And so if I look at these statistics, I don't see much difference between the two lines. They're slightly shifted, but they're saying the same thing. The problem is when I say it, it's like the two narratives in Israel between the Palestinian and the Jewish narrative. When I say it, I mean Jewish values are the same as liberal political values. And when somebody who's very conservative and passionately committed to conservative values says to me, no, my Jewish values are conservative values, I don't understand that. I don't understand how they can read the same text and see it so differently, but they do. And we have to recognize that. And how do we coexist in a big tent with each other under those circumstances?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think, because I share some of that sense. I also wonder, like this, when I see a chart like this, I want to sit down with every person and like have coffee with them, because there's so much to dig in here. And even, what did you think that this meant, right? Because I could also understand, I mean, look, like if my kids didn't identify as Jewish, that would be incredibly hard for me. But I think, again, I want to really break down, right? I feel like there's a difference between sort of saying like my Judaism doesn't matter to me, or, you know, you do have families where somebody gets married and they convert. I mean, the same way they convert to Judaism, they convert to Christianity, or they convert to another religion, where I think you do have parents who say like, what's most important is that my child's a good person. And I think for some people, sharing political convictions is the equivalent of like being a good person. You know, they're not necessarily saying, I need you to vote Democrat or I need you to vote Republican, but, you know, do you care about the poor? Do you care about the hungry? All of those things. What was also really interesting to me, and I know you just took the chart down, but what was really interesting to me is that in some ways I feel like we often assume that things go according to age. And I want to really note, like in the shared political convictions, the ones who most said that they would want them to is actually the 50 to 64, right? Not the over 65 plus, which I feel like is a stereotype we might have. Like the older you are, the more set you are in your ways or want that. And there's actually like a really significant gap within that, or the stereotype that the younger, 18, kind of teenage, and I don't actually know what generation we're calling that now, is more like cancel culture or would dismiss those who don't agree with them, but we actually don't see them being the ones who most feel like their children have to agree with them on that. So I actually find these numbers to be kind of sort of surprising in some ways. Even the carry on the family name, you might think like as you get younger, people care about it less, but the younger is straddling in between, the 30 to 49 and then the 50 to 64. So these numbers kind of just demonstrate that our community we're not fitting into the stereotypes in that way. But I agree with Jim that I really want to understand more what people mean by sharing political convictions and what they mean also by be Jewish. Do they mean like, I don't, do I care if my kids pay membership to a synagogue? Maybe, maybe not. Are we talking about celebrating Passover? Are we talking about converting to another religion? I just don't know what this means.
Well, apparently, if we look at the last line on this chart, what a lot of people, significant number of people mean by it is either marry somebody Jewish or not. And that is the most stark age-based place here where I think, Daniel, I suspect you probably intend to immerse us a little bit in that question of great controversy in the Jewish community, because this says that, a certain percentage of our population could care less about who you marry, but a substantial portion says, regardless of who you marry, be Jewish, whatever that means.
Right. Although even here, right, again, like notice the jump in age, right? Like where the 18 to 29-year-olds actually care about that more than the 30 to 49-year-old, which is also fascinating. And I wonder, I think, and maybe this is some of that pendulum also, where we're seeing this shift where
they don't have kids yet. They don't have kids getting married yet. That's why.
No, but the flip, but you have the 18 to 29-year-olds care about it more. So you have, yeah. Right, which I wonder to what extent are we seeing the pendulum kind of starting to move back, where there was this pushback to say marrying Jewish wasn't the most important thing. You also have a generation of people though who have grown up with arguably more heightened anti-Semitism, right, where you have like people over 65 who have memories of it. We had this sort of, I don't want to say golden age, we never got rid of it, but there was a period, right, where people were not talking about it in the way that I think we are feeling it in this country again, specifically coming from elected officials, right? And that's scaring people. That might be part of the pendulum swing. Or I again, without kind of being able to actually sit down and have coffee, I can't really assess all of this, but I think the numbers are fascinating.
So I want to bring in another idea, and Jim, I apologize, you've heard me rant on this many a time. That combining these two conversations for a moment, our conversations about the changing demographics, and in particular the sort of youth boom amongst Orthodox Jews, or maybe say it differently, the growing percentage of young Jews who are Orthodox. One of the things that I think has happened is I think much of liberal Judaism in the United States in the decades following, really the 50s, following the Holocaust, probably for some pretty understandable reasons, actually replaced Judaism with be Jewishism, meaning we built the Jewish institutions of our country to be a part of the Jewish identity industry, what I dismissively call continuity LLC, with the whole point and the whole message so often of everything that we did Jewish was about making our children Jewish and making them keep being Jewish and thinking of themselves as Jewish. But it became the equivalent of saying to our kids, like, here, carry this box that says you're Jewish that has no content inside of it, or we don't particularly care what kind of content there is inside of it. And yet, what at least I see in Orthodoxy is actually that there's a real strong sense of mission. There's a purpose, right? It may be halachic purpose, but there's a purpose, there's a mission, there's what our teacher, David Hartman, of blessed memory, would call a Sinai vision for the world. And I wonder if that's not part of what we're seeing here too, is a rejection of the Jewish identity industry by people who are interested in doing Jewish and learning Jewish and being Jewish, just not in being a part of this propagating Jewish identity business. And that's one of those gaps I think we see, right? And in that sense, you could chart political convictions next to marry Jewish almost as that conversation.
Right, is being Jewish my identity, or is being Jewish a description of a set of behaviors and passions and commitments, not belonging, not measures of belonging and identity? I think that's what we're witnessing as we witness plummeting rates of affiliation with traditional organizational affiliations, be they synagogues or churches, or be they community centers or other clubs of identity. And we see much more people self-defining based on, well, Jewish is what I do or don't do. Don't tell me that I'm less Jewish if I marry somebody other than the person you think I should marry, or that if I pay dues to some organization that you think I should affiliate with.
Well, I think, and to that, I mean, I know you're bringing up another slide, but I think what I'm hearing in you saying is Judaism an ends or a means? Right? Like,
yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. And for me, I mean, look, I'll also say, as somebody who's in the Orthodox community and who's deeply immersed and who's incredibly passionate about it, I don't think Judaism, I see it as a means, not an end, right? Like the goal for me is not to be Jewish, right? Like Judaism is how I then live my life to bring me to make a better world, to live a better life, to be closer to God. I mean, we can fill in all of these different gaps, but if the goal at the end of the day is just like, what do we need to do so that you feel Jewish? I feel like there's a lot of, I think our Jewish institutions have done that. And I think we have a whole group of people who feel like, okay, you spent a lot of money on me. I got scholarships to summer camp, all of these things, but why? Right? Like that, like we never answered the why, because, and that to me also comes back to all of the other things that we do, right? Like if the goal is for you to be Jewish, but our Jewish community isn't talking about the world around us, if we're not actually addressing the major crises, if we're not actually rallying to fight some of the greatest injustices, or if we're not like, then what's the point, right? Why am I part of this Jewish community if it's not getting me to something bigger?
And regardless of the denomination, I think the Jewish community as an institution, as a whole, has invested at least the last half century, if not the last half millennium or more, in Jewish in behaviors, where the behavior or the practice precedes the why. Just do it. Whether it's somebody saying keep kosher or daven regularly according to a set schedule, or whether it says send your kids to Sunday school, or support a synagogue, because that's the goal in and of itself. That's what we've said, and people are saying no. Rory, to your point, people are saying, increasingly voting with their feet, saying no. Why? What is this all about? What's the purpose of
it? Okay, let's bring in some more texts here. If you all see anything that particularly stands out to you on this chart, feel free to bring it out. The one that I really like, and it's maybe my favorite statistic in the entire Pew report, is comparing Jewish adults, that's what we've got on the left column, to all US adults on the right. 56% of all US adults say that they believe in the God of the Jewish Bible, compared with less than half of that number amongst Jews who say that they believe in the God of the Bible. I want to go back to what Carol Rose said before too, in terms of Jewish identity migrating on from the sort of Christian version of religiosity that it was at for a while. I think we see this here, but do either of you have a response to this or see anything else in this chart that?
Well, I think you can't divorce that observation, which I agree with you. It's profound and almost comical that the majority of people in our country say that they believe in the God of our Bible, and only a quarter of our people say that we believe in the God of our Bible. But you can't divorce that from the very next line, that 50% of Jews nonetheless say, well, yeah, I believe in God. I just don't believe in God as described by the Hebrew Bible. So there's a substantial overlap of those two that I think they have to be discussed together.
Yeah. Thank you. Though it's worth noting that we get to 76 when you add in those numbers for Jews who in the broadest senses believe in a deity, and you get to basically 90% amongst Americans in general. So
Right.
there's still a substantial difference there.
Yeah.
Rory?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, what I also find interesting, I think Jews are just like, we're such a different kind of group of people also, I mean, because it's fascinating to me also the number, right? So attend religious service weekly, you've got 27% of all US Jews and only 12% of Jewish adults. When you get to a few times a year, like that number also jumps up for Jews. And in ways where I think, it's a much more normative thing. Like, I think that there's just within, I'm thinking specifically of Christianity, where, there's this kind of culture of weekly church service, or, I mean, not to say that we don't have a culture of that within Judaism also in terms of weekly service, but, there's really no shame of like, come when you want. I mean, there's something I actually find really beautiful in that sense of like that is exactly who we are. We're like a people who like really don't know about this God in the book that we study all the time. Definitely think there's something that's bigger than us, but not sure if it's that guy. Don't feel like we need to go every week, but can go whenever we feel like it. And like, I don't know, I kind of love those people too.
Yes.
Okay, so I think this is my last chart that I have one more chart after this of portraits of who American Jews are, and then we're going to look at what American Jews think about Israel. This chart is a stunning chart and not at all a surprising chart to me. Right, so just to frame this, this is the percentage of marriages that happened during that particular decade that involved a Jew, and what percentage of them are a marriage to someone who is not Jewish. Which, absent the 1980s, is basically a straight line here, right? And if you were to cut them in the middle of the decade rather than the end of the decade, it actually looks kind of like a straight line. So I'd love to hear responses to this chart from both of you.
Well, look, for me, my entire career as a rabbi, I have believed deeply and passionately and with great conviction that affirming people's right, Jewish people and everybody else's right to marry whoever they love and to be embraced wholeheartedly without qualification for their choice of who they marry, and to be welcomed into whatever community we are, for that is a conviction. I have always officiated in a faith marriage. I have always sought to fully welcome people who are choosing to marry somebody who is in the Jewish community or not, fully, without hesitation, not just as a default position, but out of conviction. And this chart just, I suppose somebody could say it's your fault, people like you, Rabbi, but this chart for me undergirds why I believe so deeply in that. How can I reject 3/4 of the people who got married in the last decade? I mean, what an absurdity to send them any message other than you are full, Mazel tov, exactly. So, I am buoyed by this, even though that sounds counterintuitive, because I don't think this is a bad statistic for the Jewish community. I just think it is a statistic, and we should respond to it the same way we respond to every other fact about our community. But I know that's controversial. I know it's a source of great contention within the Jewish community, and especially across the denominations. And I understand that too. So Rory, I'll kind of turn to you to respond in however way you feel.
I'm going to take this chart down just as a reminder. There's a link both in the chat, and if you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, there should be a link in your description to all of these if you'd like to look at them.
Again, like, to me, like, this chart, there's so much that's undergirding it that I think we just don't quite know, because, as somebody who, like, personally, it never really occurred to me to marry somebody not Jewish, but not because I remember like the stories when we were kids of like parents sitting Shiva, but it wasn't because of like fear of my parents, or, I don't think people tend to do things out of fear, but because I felt like the life that I lead is such an immersive Jewish life that, how to have a household with somebody if like I have a kosher house and I keep Shabbat, and like, what does it look like? And so it wasn't even for me just a matter of marrying someone Jewish, but marrying someone who was going to be halakhically deeply immersed in all of these things in the exact same way. So, I think there's some people who look at this chart with great sadness in terms of saying, these are people who don't think that their Judaism is a value, that they don't care in terms of marrying Jewish. But I'm not convinced that that's true, because I think what we've also learned, that's what sociologists were saying for many decades, and that's what they were warning us against. And I think what we've started to realize is that being Jewish just means really different things to different people. And what's been most surprising about these statistics, and I don't know kind of the breakdown of it, is that instead of where sociologists kept thinking that they were thinking that 72% of people was going to stop being Jewish, but that also kind of goes back to a time where, I think we have this memory of the ways in which we've been oppressed. And if you could get out of the ghetto, of course you'd be out of the ghetto. And why would you be part of this people if you didn't have to be part of this people? But what we've actually realized is that our community has grown because we have all of these people who have not converted or joined, but who very much see themselves as part of the Jewish community. And they're the people, you both can speak to it better, because this is not what I do on a daily basis, but they're the people who are bringing their kids to Hebrew school, or who are bringing their kids to their B'nai Mitzvah practice, or who are helping their kids with their B'nai Mitzvah project, or who are sitting on our boards, or who are, raising money, or they're joining our committees in a variety of ways. So that's the part that I think we could never have fathomed. And in some ways, I think that's our own sense of lacking self-confidence, was that, I think we thought that Jews, if they given the choice, would leave, and we didn't think that non-Jews would actually want to hang out with us.
So, Jim, please.
No, I want to hear what you have to say.
I was just going to frame this chart right here also as a success story, which is not how we normally talk about this, right? So much of the energy and the money of the Jewish community over the last 50 years has gone into fighting intermarriage, or as I called it before, continuity LLC, which I think is ultimately self-defeating, right? As we're kind of saying here. But I think what we're forgetting is that for Jews, particularly who came to this country during the great wave of Ashkenazi migration from 1880 to 1914 or so, for those people and their kids, assimilation was a success story. It wasn't a failure, it was a goal. And there's no society in the history of Jews where we previously could have imagined being so embraced into the core of the world around us that 71% of our young people not just are choosing to, but are living in a world where it's even conceivable that they could marry someone who wasn't Jewish. And I think we need to hold on to that, because we get so used to framing it as a failure. And I actually think this is the opposite. And it comes with side effects and symptoms and things to deal with. But yeah.
It's not only is it a success story in that way, which I agree with Daniel, which is really powerful and important, but also I remember, and I can't quote the statistic, but I remember a number of arguments that prove both statistically and in real on the ground facts that intermarriage actually increases the number of people exposed to and active in Jewish community, that actually a communal and societal acceptance, at least in the non-Orthodox Jewish community, for keruv, for welcoming and drawing near by full acceptance of people who choose to marry somebody who is not from the Jewish community into our midst, actually leads to increased Jewish engagement and increased Jewish commitment and increased living out of Jewish values. As Rory said, non-Jewish parents and spouses who are the ones who are actually volunteering on behalf of our value statements and bringing their kids to get a Jewish education. So the narrative that failed, the failed narrative, was the frightening, terrifying specter of intermarriage being another nail in the coffin of the Jewish people. Quite to the contrary, intermarriage may ultimately be seen as something that saved the Jewish people and kept us alive. I know that's counterintuitive, but I think it's supportable.
Okay, my last image from pictures of American Jews today and their values, which is that we are seeing the top number here of net Jews and how we vote actually hasn't significantly changed since FDR. But what has changed is the way that polarization has impacted denominations. And one of the things, Rory, I know we've talked about this, not dealing with this chart, just sort of anecdotally, the two of us have talked about this, the phenomenon that is happening where there are people whose values politically are Republican and right wing, and so find themselves today a part of the Orthodox community, even as they don't keep kosher, even as they don't keep Shabbat traditionally, even as they, and so we are seeing a polarization around between the movements themselves. I was also surprised personally that there wasn't a bigger difference between conservative and reform here. That kind of surprised me. So anyways, thoughts. I mean, and in some ways there's nothing surprising here, but yeah.
Yeah, that the last observation you made about conservative versus reform does not surprise me. I think across the world and across the country as a whole, the reform and conservative movements are fairly identical in terms of ideological leaning, with variations on the theme. There are more conservative, perhaps a little more politically conservative, more ritualistically observant, but we're very similar. To me, the really sad part of this chart is the huge divide, the polarization between the so-called Orthodox branch of the Jewish community and the rest of the Jewish community. When we talk about the importance of Jewish unity, and when people make the point that it is disunity that ultimately could destroy and be our greatest threat, this polarization is tragic. It's sad, and our inability to talk to each other or even have any meaningful interaction. I think about my own experience as a rabbi in this Jewish community. I barely interact with and know anybody from the Orthodox community. There is no place where we work together, increasingly less and less. And that is deeply sad. And if that's fueled by this polarization over politics and or Israel, that's devastating and corrosive to the future of American Jewish life.
I agree with all of that. There's a couple of things that I find really striking. I'm also struck, and I would be interested in knowing the comparison to the rest of the American population. Like, I'm struck that there's such a small percentage that have no leaning, considering that I feel like everyone I talk to wants to tell me that they're independent, but I'm sort of skeptical, right? Because like 3% of the population actually has no leaning. So that's really interesting to me. I agree really with everything that Jim just said. When I was at Hartman 2 summers ago, Yehuda Kurtzer gave a lecture on July 4th where he talked about kind of politics taking over religion for people, and this idea of exactly this, that people are more likely to align less because of their denomination and more because of their political leanings. And I think we're seeing it within the St. Louis community. And it's painful for me also because of the number of people for whom, even in this conversation, I can't be an Orthodox representative because I'm not staunchly representing a right-wing conservative viewpoint, which is not to say that I don't disagree politically with the two of you on occasion, but but I do think there's ways in which like there's this growing divide and where we're actually having less conversations because we're allowing our politics to then also take over where exactly we're falling out. And I think, for me also just personally, where being a woman in Orthodoxy is already somewhat of a marginal position, having gone to Yeshivat Maharat already puts me in this marginal position. But then like, because people don't see my politics as being where they want Orthodox politics to be, then suddenly like that's what sort of pushes me out of even, like I said, being able to be an Orthodox voice in this space. I do see in the chat that people are talking about why the Orthodox tend to align more so with Republicans, and I'm happy to talk about it from where I sit within the community. Some people are saying that it's about Israel, and I think Israel is one piece of it. I do think that we are seeing probably going back to I don't remember now what year it was, but I think kind of the big moment for the American Jewish community seems to have been when Bibi went to Congress and bypassed Barack Obama, was sort of like a point at which Prime Minister Netanyahu really aligned himself significantly with Republicans, and there was really a lot of pushback against the Democratic Party that also came with the Iran nuclear deal and ways in which the American Jewish community and the Democrats were pushing strongly for the Iran nuclear deal when Israel was pushing heavily against it. And so you started to see some divide within that in terms of like Israel kind of politically. And so, although then we have to still figure out why is Israel identity more significant. I would argue, I don't know that it has to be more significant in the Orthodox community than in others, but I think you actually see, for a long time working in interfaith, I would talk about that. I felt like the thing that we were missing when we talked about interfaith cooperation is that I think people are not necessarily aligned because of specific faiths, but actually because of ideology. So what I mean by that is that when you have liberals in the Christian community and you have liberals in the Jewish community, it's kind of easy. And I don't mean necessarily political liberals, but like religious liberals. So people understand what it is to take a sacred text and to bring it into modernity. And so the idea that you're going to do that in different ways, but we're going to kind of respect your process. I found that with religious Christians or religious Jews or religious Muslims, there would be this way in which you could, even if you don't believe in my practice, or even as an Orthodox Jew, if I would think that like what you were doing was completely wrong, I understand, right? I understand. So like, I don't think you have to fast for the month of Ramadan, but the idea that you feel commanded to fast, of course I understand that. I fast like 6 times a year, right? So there's a way in which I think there's sort of this ideology that we understand. And I do think that Republicans making themselves the party of conservative religion, and particularly evangelicals, it's fascinating because Orthodox Jews disagree significantly with interpretations of the Bible, but the idea that you would live your life according to your understanding of the Bible, so much so that you would get involved with politics to bring that into the wider world, or that you would advocate and that you would go against your own self-interest for that understanding of what God wants for you, that's a concept that we understand, even if we think your interpretation is wrong. And so I think there's a lot of Orthodox Jews who, I think Israel is one component of it, but I think that they really do see Republicans as a party of conservative values, and in a way where they understand conservative values, whether or not those values are particularly the values that they would espouse.
So I think I agree with basically everything you just said, Rory. I do want to push back a little bit, not from you necessarily, but from the sort of broader conversation and just the cultural discourse around how they vote that way because of Israel, right? Jews vote for Republicans because of Israel. My experience has been the opposite, actually, that I know very few people where I share basically all of my political values other than we see Israel differently, and that causes them to vote for Republicans. I know very few people. The people who say that, I find tend to have very different politics than me broadly. But to back away from this, I am convinced, part of this has come, I really recommend Ezra Klein's book, Why We Are Polarized, which is a review of some of the social science research. But I'm convinced that the reason we do things, first of all, is almost never the reason we think we do things. That's just the explanation we give ourselves. But beyond that, there has been a psychological sorting that has happened amongst white people in the United States along our political parties. That actually in all sorts of unrelated ways, when it comes to fear responses, when it comes to disgust responses, when it comes to openness to new experience, what has happened is that white people have sorted ourselves based on our psychology, and actually there's some good evidence that it might even be related to our genetics, into our political parties. And it's only happened with white people because, of course, people of color and minorities and queer folks and other discriminated minorities in this country are basically not welcome in the white nationalist Republican Party. So it's only a phenomenon that we see with white people, but to me, I think that's what's happening. I think broadly my experience has been that about 80% of the Orthodox folk that I know are broadly conservative in their worldview. And they may explain it to themselves that it's about Israel. But again, I think that's the equivalent of Catholics who explain their voting based on abortion, when really it just becomes a symbol of it all. And about 80% of the Jews that I know in the liberal world are liberal in their worldview and in their psychology. Yeah, Jim.
And no, I just want to build on what you said, Daniel, and I'm agreeing with you 100%. For example, I think many other issues other than Israel may be the most obvious, but school choice and government support for vouchers for private education, issues of social conservatism, and the values of a more conservative society. We can just create a very big list. And just as I am so shocked and deeply troubled by how evangelical Christians could hold their nose and nonetheless support a person who obviously and publicly is the exact antithesis of everything their faith speaks about in terms of marital fidelity and public behavior, and you can go down the list. So too Orthodox Jews who are, and not just Orthodox Jews, I will level this accusation against Jews of all denominations who claim to be deeply committed to things that are core values of Judaism, like family and fidelity and honesty and truthfulness, and then would hold their nose and support candidates or a president who is the antithesis of those things, is incomprehensible to me. And I think it's oversimplification to claim that Israel alone is the reason, Jewish survival alone is the reason. It's much more than that. And without being argumentative with those who don't agree, greed plays a great deal into this, and self-serving justification of personal wealth is a motivating factor that we should not ignore. A tax code that is more favorable to people who benefit from it than to those who are vulnerable and don't benefit from it. These are Jewish values too, and they need to be said aloud. And we shouldn't be polarized when we talk about them. We should be honest when we talk about them.
I'm struggling because I don't totally disagree with all of that you're saying, but I also find, Daniel just put in the chat, he said, it wasn't like people kind of held their noses in order to do it. There were people to whom, I think like Trump and Trumpism is sort of its own phenomenon that I think is also different from the Republican Party, although we can debate whether it is or isn't at this point, but in terms of historically. But, there were a lot of people for whom that was really something that they were people were incredibly proud of. There was something that excited them within what Trump was talking about. There was a deep feeling of pride that he created, that people were like, they wanted to be part of this entourage. They wanted to be part of this narrative that he was creating. And I think that's something that we also need to be able to recognize in terms of the ability to have this story. And I think you're right. I don't think we should oversimplify it with Israel, but I think Israel was one component of it, right? It was this whole narrative of winning, right? We were winning, right? If you were you were a Trump supporter, you were winning. And I think for some in the Jewish community, what he did for Israel was part of the winning, but was certainly, and I think what he did in terms of the tax code, all of those things were certainly part of the winning. And I think part of what has made that so divisive within the community. And it was interesting for me just being in Israel, hearing people also talk about Bibiism as a phenomenon and all of that, because I think Bibi Netanyahu did something very similar within Israel. You can debate who did it first and who kind of copied, but it was partisanship over country, right? The transition of government in Israel was horrific. If anyone watched it, right, when Naftali Bennett got up to speak and everybody started, and the jeering that took place. And if you saw, you should read Yair Lapid's speech, because it was like such a, my mother came to watch this and you've just embarrassed yourselves. Feel like the most Jewish speech you could possibly give. But it was this idea that, but also what happened on January 6th, Trump not going to the inauguration, right? What had been before, this idea that you could actually have this peaceful transition of power, or that somehow what was happening in this country was bigger than any one of us. And suddenly it wasn't. It became about your winning. And I think that we lost something in that, because it was, I think to your point, Jim, right? It was about if I felt like I was winning, I was good. And it didn't matter that the rest of the country was losing. It didn't matter if I won on the backs of other people. And so that is a narrative that I think has taken hold, but I think it's important that we talk about, because the same way we were just talking about with Hebron or with Sheikh Jarrah, like if we can't hear all of these stories, we're also never going to be able to move forward as a country.
So we've only got a few minutes left. I want to bring some of these conversations together with some new numbers here. In particular, I want to look right at this middle here. To me, this is the key here, but maybe there are other things here. View caring about Israel as essential to being Jewish, meaning has to be a part of a Jewish identity. This is almost twice as common if you're over 65 as if you're under 30. And I don't think that's any surprise to any of us, but I actually think a lot of the conversations that we have as a Jewish community here in the United States really are about this, right? Where different generations have very different understandings and different values, and we end up talking past each other.
Daniel, I just literally earlier before we logged on saw a headline in Haaretz, the Israeli.
So Jim, I think what the headline you saw is this next chart, which I just pulled for us, which I'm just going to put this one up as our real chart here. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, the headline I saw said that a quarter of U.S. Jews today say
that's what this is from.
That Israel is an apartheid state. Right, this is it. Exactly, this is it. Shocking. It's shocking.
So that number is 13% over 65 agree that it is an apartheid state. And it's almost 40%, 4 in 10, of Jews in the United States under 40 who believe Israel is an apartheid state.
Right.
Yeah, and the three categories on this particular chart, and this comes from the JTA, are the purple is disagree and believe that it's anti-Semitic. There's disagree, but it's not anti-Semitic. You just disagree, and then there's agree.
Meaning criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic.
Correct. So, for instance, amongst those who are under the age of 40, 38% believe that Israel is an apartheid state, and 32% believe that calling Israel an apartheid state is anti-Semitic, which talk about an enormous divide within a generation.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm assuming based on the other numbers also probably that those numbers, right, you can account for where the Orthodox population is in these by and large. You can use sort of the Pew stuff to reverse engineer a little bit. Other thoughts looking here, Rory?
You know, I'm looking at it also compared to this first line of whether Israel has the right to exist or not. And because I think that's oftentimes our fear when we have this conversation, is that we're afraid to admit, look, I don't want to start, you know, but like when you look at these numbers in terms of whether or not this is apartheid or genocide, or if treatment of Palestinians is similar to racism, because you get into these numbers are all higher. People who agree with these are all higher than the number of people who agree that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. And even within that, just, you know, speaking to people under 40, I would imagine that some of those 20%, I don't want to completely defend the number because I don't know them, but I think that some of them, having spoken to some of them, would probably say like, states don't have rights, or, you know, like, I don't even think they would say like, I want Israel to disappear tomorrow, which is a different question, you know, but whether or not, like, what does it even mean for Israel to have a right to exist, right? What's the right of a country? But I think it's really striking the number of people who, you know, like support Israel's right to exist, even as they are deeply grappling with, right? So I'm not going to actually get into the truth of each of these statements, but that people believe these statements to be true does not counteract whether or not they believe that Israel has a right to exist. And so that means that we, the Jewish community, the organized Jewish community, we keep fighting this war about whether or not Israel has a right to exist. And we're afraid that if we said Israel is discriminating against a population, then that takes away its right to exist. When we've got a Jewish community that overwhelmingly agrees that Israel has a right to exist, and yet thinks that Israel is, in staggering statistics, engaged in horrific treatment of Palestinians.
Yes, everything you just said. I remember a very disturbing argument I had, Daniel, one of our years at Hartman, when I argued, and I'm almost in the oldest segmentation of this group. I'm not quite in the 64 and plus group, but I'm getting dangerously close. But nonetheless, my personal belief is that there is a tremendous similarity between the face of racism in this country and everywhere else in the world, and the way the Palestinians are treated in Israel and the occupied territories. And I was powerfully argued, no, they're not the same thing. Criticizing Palestinians or restricting Palestinians is not racism because we're the same race. That was the argument that was being made, which was an absurd argument. Instead of this person saying, why do you feel that way? How does this feel like racism to you? And I think it's time, and you and I, we've talked about this a lot, Daniel, it's time for us to acknowledge the legitimacy of a perspective that says it feels like racism to me. So can we talk about it? If the Jewish community continues to shout it down and call it anti-Semitism, that will only further prove the point, I'm afraid. And we have to conclude that with an acknowledgement of each other and a willingness to listen to each other.
So I think that's the perfect lead-in, Jim, to a closing note here to talk about the op-ed that we all published in the Jewish Light last week. By the way, anyone who has any complaints about that, Rabbi Rose at b'nai-emunah.org is the. No, I'd encourage people, and I'm sure Autumn will drop a link into the chat now. But I'd encourage people to go read that if you haven't, because there are people who don't want us to be having this conversation, and instead want the public discourse, particularly as it comes to what American Jews think and feel and care about with Israel, to be limited to a very sort of small slice. So I want to share one last chart here that I am struck by. So this is from a poll. Obviously, all of Pew 2020 was taken while Donald Trump was still the president of the United States, asking American Jews to rate President Trump's handling on Israel. And it's worth noting that a majority of American Jews rate it as somewhere between poor and only fair, which to me is once again another one of these really important markers and reminders that the Israel discourse that we see in this country, particularly the so-called pro-Israel discourse amongst politicians, is usually about white evangelicals and not about us. And that actually the view of American Jews when it comes to Israel and when it comes to American policy on Israel is much more diverse and much more multi-layered and multifaceted than people imagine, and often more so than we allow within our communities, which is to say that I think there are a lot of American Jews who believe that they are outsiders to the American Jewish community because of their Israel views, when in fact they actually represent the normative majority view of American Jews. So I want to sort of open that as an opportunity for closing thoughts from both of you. As we say goodbye to this session, I know we missed Carney Rose, even as he did not miss us in Mexico. Again, complaints should be offered to his email address. So Jim, you want to go first? You're unmuted.
Oh, sorry. There's so much to share, but I just want to say, I think I want to return to the same theme that I began with when we were reflecting on our experiences in Israel, whether it has to do with our dialogue or our disagreements about Israel, whether it has to do with our political polarization in this country, whether it has to do with our own St. Louis Jewish community and our tendency to kind of cover our ears and only speak. I just think we cannot afford this any longer. And those people who feel the need to silence voices that they don't agree with are endangering our community. Our community is healthier and more well off when we listen to voices that we don't agree with, when we listen to voices we don't understand, and we try and hear them. And I think those of us, I count us as leaning perhaps more progressively in many ways, we are just as responsible for this as are those with whom we don't agree. We should be listening to the other voices and not, as I'm inclined to do sometimes, shutting them off. And I just want to remind us all that, especially as we're getting ready, we're heading towards the month of Elul and a time of reflection individually and communally. This is a good thing for us to start thinking about again, mutually and together. And I'm grateful, as I know you all are as well, to be able to be part of a dialogue and a friendship that lets this happen.
I also want to go back to where we started, and because I think, Jim, you brought up how we tell these stories about other people. And, I think when we talk about it in the context of Israel, oftentimes, right, what enables us to kind of move forward with some things is to, oftentimes we have to either erase people from their stories, or we have to actually take away the humanity of people, right? That's why it's okay for people to be treated a certain way because it's for their own good, or they don't deserve it, or like as a Jewish community, we know what that is so much so. And I feel that so deeply in what we're trying to bring up and in what we talked about in the op-ed, and hopefully we'll keep unpacking this further. But I want to respond because there are some concerns. I know that there were people who felt like it was so ridiculous. Here we are with a platform we've all got. There's hundreds of people who tune into these videos. You all have congregations where people are listening, and this idea that we're sort of claiming this victimhood. And I want to be clear that I don't feel like a victim. But when we're talking about bullying and silencing, what we're talking about is a group of people that has to go through that process, that what we're saying is somehow so scary that the only response is to decide that we're not worthy of whatever it is, right? It's not a group of people who wants to disagree. It's a group of people that feels like we're not worthy to have jobs, that we're not worthy to have free time. We're not worthy to feel comfortable in the community. And I just want to be really clear, because that has come at us through our families, through our children, through countless other ways that are just horrific. And that in speaking out, it's not speaking out specifically for all of us, although I do want to speak out for my colleagues here, but I know that they're strong and bold and brave people. But for all the people who feel scared to speak up because of what they see happening, we love having dialogue with people. I will tell you, of all the hate mail I get, my most common response is to invite people for coffee, and I find that about 93% of the time they say no, which is fascinating to me, because it's people who don't actually want to talk about these things. And so that to me, and that's why I think it's just so important that we have to lean into these moments. It's about listening, it's about learning, it's about all of the different ways. Certainly we here don't represent every viewpoint that exists within our Jewish community, but I think what we're trying to really elevate is a process of being open and of listening. And I think about that in our own context. I think about that in terms of how we talk about American politics, and I think about it in terms of how we talk about Israel, because as soon as we are comfortable dehumanizing other people and thinking that we have the right to take something away from them, whether it's their job, their livelihood, their dignity, their home, then we have become something that I don't want to be a part of.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Jim. Carney, we missed you. Big thank you to Autumn for the production help in the background. And we will be back next month. We're committed to, when the calendar works, doing this the second Tuesday of every month. So thank you, both of you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you to the Shalom Hartman Institute. And we'll see you all later.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Daniel.
And whoever's host has to turn off the stream, Autumn or Rory.